And we are back on the 0 Hour. I'm your host, Richard RJ Eskow. Joining us once again, I haven't talked to him for a while, is Nathan J. Robinson. Nathan is, as you may well know already, he is the editor and publisher of Current Affairs magazine. He is the author of several fine books, including Why You Should Be a Socialist. And he is the author of one or two articles, or essays rather, recently that I have been looking forward to speaking with him about, especially Life in Revolutionary Times, lessons from the 1960s, and strange as it may sound, I was actually there. So without any further ado, Nathan J. Robinson, thanks for coming back on the program.
Nice to be with you. I can't believe you were there. I thought we were the same. I thought we were the same age, or roughly similar.
Well, we were born on the same day, but not in the same year, as it turns out.
Okay.
Many people get confused by that.
Yeah.
So in 1969, which is the year I think you focus on more than any other in this piece, although you talk about the 60s as a chunk of years, but in 1969, I turned 16. And I tried to find a newspaper article because I went to March on Washington that year and was quoted in the newspaper and sounded like such a stoned out hippie kid that I'm kind of glad I didn't find it. You know, I think I said something like, oh, it was an incredibly schizophrenic scene, man. You know, there were army people over here and demonstrators over here. And, you know, it was just that kind of thing. But that's what the 60s were like. Yeah. And it was great. What can I tell you? I wouldn't have missed it for the world, even if it meant being this old now, which I am.
You know, I do spend a portion of the article defending kids like you who are quoted in the newspaper talking like that, because there's something as I was reading all this 60s material, there is so much that just falls right into all the cliches. It really is kind of incredible how some things really live up to the stereotypes. But there is also a certain magic, a certain loveliness to it. There's a really kind of incredible, there's this beautiful, naive spirit of, being able to say very sincerely that we should just all love one another. In the age of irony and disaffection, there's something very sweet about a certain attitude among the 60s generation.
Yeah, and I mean, I think, first of all, they weren't all cliches yet. I mean, they were on their way to becoming cliches. Right. But secondly, although the song is often misinterpreted, I appreciate the misinterpretation of the song "What's So Funny About Peace, Love, and Understanding" by Elvis Costello, written by Nick Lowe, which is what is so, if you're going to go wrong, that ain't a bad way to go wrong, right? To be in favor of stopping wars, supporting more compassion and love, and trying to understand each other. If you're going to err in one direction or another, that's, to me, you could do a lot worse, I guess I would say.
Yeah, right. All the goofy love stuff. You think, well, it might be goofy, but the fact that it was done in the service of the hatred of war and militarism. And, you can say that the belief in universal human brotherhood and sisterhood and, let's all wear flowers and hold hands is, oblivious to political reality. But also, like, it's something that I kind of feel is missing a little bit. And you look at like the posters for like the human being and the love-ins and you think this is kind of incredible that there was this subset of people who did this very, very sincerely in a way that they really and truly felt for a moment. And And I was thinking about the question, how can a social trend like that develop? You can create narratives about why, but it really is something peculiar and fascinating that I've certainly never lived through anything similar.
Well, and I'll tell you, when my son was about 3 years old, we took him to his first movie, and it was an IMAX movie at the Smithsonian. And when they started to have the rocket, it was about the first one of the missile launches or something, the moon launches. When they started to show the rocket moving down the track toward the launch site, he turned to us and said, "Why is the theater moving?" And I thought, he's going to have a distorted sense of the cinematic experience for the rest of his life. Nothing is going to live up to this. And that's what being 14 in 1968 was like. It was like my son seeing his first movie and it being an IMAX, because I was very political. I had a very political older brother who was part of the Yippies and close to Abby Hoffman. I've had him on the program talking about Abby and the Yippies. So I knew all about this stuff. And remember, 1968, there was so much going on, including, the assassinations of King and Robert Kennedy, and the demonstrations and the rebellions in the streets of, our cities. And I thought, wow, current events is really interesting. And, there was a kind of, for lack of a better term, a kind of technicolor aspect to it that seems to have vanished.
Did you have a sense, at that time? Do you remember if you had a kind of sense of something that was transitory and might end, or that society was trending in a particular direction? I cite Hunter Thompson's passage, the Wave speech, where he talks about this sort of great tidal wave that broke, and that's often used and then receded in the 1970s as everyone returned to their previous cynicism. Did that sense strike you at the time? Was it true only in retrospect?
Well, it's a great question. In the moment, to me at least, it seemed almost, what's the word? Almost, I'm blanking, millennialist, almost, that this could turn one of two ways, but either would be dramatic. Either that things would get significantly better, or that we would be living in a fascist dystopia. It never occurred to us that we could go back to something like the dismal mediocrity that had preceded it. But I would disagree with Hunter Thompson in one sense. I don't have a great memory of what preceded all of this, but it felt to me as if the 70s were a different kind of mediocrity than what had come before. Maybe because people had glimpsed something different and walked away from it. I'm thinking of a cartoon I saw in one of the music. I was a rock music fanatic and musician back then. And in one of the rock music magazines, so I saw a lot of these concerts in the 60s, Beatles at Shea Stadium in 1966, Jimi Hendrix, I was on the stage at Hunter College in 1967. There was a disc jockey used to do these package shows, so I saw the first U.S. performance of The Who and Cream when I was 30. Just like million.
I don't want to hear about this. I just
and when I was in 1971 or 2, there was a cartoon in one of the music magazines, and it showed all these like hippie types, but families, each of them in a VW van, camper van, but there were just one after another receding off into the distance, everyone identical, and the sun setting on them, and the caption was, "The dream is over." So it kind of led to this new enforced, I've actually thought about writing this. It kind of split into this almost like libertarian, you could be a long-haired pro-business. I mean, I think about when Howard Stern came up, and it was originally kind of a reactionary libertarian type, although I think he may have changed. But all of that, the whole rock culture thing, which seemed to break things open, suddenly became a vehicle for like narcissism and individualism and self-indulgence. And
like Howard Stern is in a way the direct descendant of Abbie Hoffman.
Oh, I think Abbie would be nauseous at that thought.
It's not, but that's kind of the horrible truth, right? Is that like what was politically empowered kind of challenges to censorship and had kind of this set of moral values, as you say, that kind of perverts and transforms itself into, it's got the same kind of shock the establishment quality, but without any of the sort of underlying communalistic values. That's rather sad.
Yeah, well, Abbie Hoffman was very devoted to communalistic values and had a pretty, I would say Howard Stern is more a descendant of Jerry Rubin. And
okay, yeah.
But there is that element of, one element of the whole 60s rebellion, and I include in that Terry Southern and Paul Krasner and all these other writers, was sexual liberation was treated as part of of the overall resistance against the establishment, and it quickly became just another indulgence, which Country Joe McDonald, to his credit, called out very early in a song about how hippie culture demeaned women. I believe there was a lyric in there about the women in the commune giving head and baking homemade bread. I mean, he kind of got that sense of early on, but I think a lot of people either gave the whole thing up or, the self-indulgence became shock jock land, which is sad. Yeah. But I want to ask you something, Nathan.
Okay.
Partly because you're my guest, and partly because
I'm sorry. I'm kind of turning this around on you and asking you about.
No, that's okay. I mean, I just don't want to give into it as attractive as it is. Yeah. Completely. I don't want to completely give it. You can still ask me something. But what drew you to this topic? What made you? I mean, you talk about your love of the music of the era and all that, but.
Yeah, well, I mean, I was thinking about the fact, I don't know quite how I got into a lot of 60s stuff as a teenager, but I did. I ended up listening to a lot of 60s music, and I just became very obsessive for a while. And I write in the article, I became so obsessive at a point when I was about 13 that I would only listen to music from 1965 to 1969. I would check when things were recorded to make sure they weren't recorded in 1970 or 1971. And I was and this sort of just crossed my mind recently. And I was thinking, that was a very weird thing for you to do, pick out that particular period. Was there something about it? And of course, I've always, I went to Brandeis, which is where Abbie Hoffman went and where Angela Davis went and Herbert Marcuse taught. And it had, you had that kind of spirit of 60s leftism kind of lingering a little bit over the campus, and everyone knew it had kind of gone away, and Brandeis had become more corporatized, but it was still something in the air, and we still had an SDS chapter, and they tried to reenact old times. But Bill Ayers came to campus. I mean, it was real kind of real reenactment society in some ways. And I was thinking about it, and I was thinking, it's kind of laughable, but I was also looking back on it and realizing, well, okay, I'm leftist now, and we have this burgeoning left movement. And what was the last time we had something that was a really, really powerful left movement? And of course, it's the mid to late 1960s. And, we need to study that because we need to find out what happened, because it is true. This is the other thing, is that I think you're right that the wave isn't quite right, because that implies that something came and then went. But in fact, the 60s really did transform society in a lot of in a lot of actual fundamental ways, right? It was very different to be a person beforehand and the person after. I mean, people would get beaten up for having hair my length, right?
My wife was literally in danger where I lived. I was actually in danger for my life. Some long hairs had been murdered down the street from me.
Because you get chased down, right, by a gang
yes.
of
and yeah, it was terrifying, actually. Which then raises the question: why did I do it? Right? Because why would I put myself? But there was that sense of something belonging to something greater. That, however trivial it might be in terms of hair length, I was also suspended from school for my hair. You know, why bother? Well, because it was a symbol that you belong to something greater than yourself, which may be what you feel the lack of now. I don't know.
And it is incredible. I mean, the first wave of the feminist movement really made triumphs. I mean, you read interviews with women who grew up in the 50s talking about just how awful it was to be a young girl in the 50s, where essentially you are told your job is to find a husband and obey your husband. And it doesn't matter if that satisfies you, it's fulfilling. It doesn't matter if you have to live alone in the house doing housework all day in a kind of endless and infinite tedium that lasts until your death. That is your place. And this is what young girls were told. And I mean, obviously it's still true in certain segments of American society that there's a kind of ethic like that. But like, I think that in our cynicism, where we think that nothing has, you know, everything still sucks. It's true that everything is still, and I think, one quote I read was that if you know, it's awful to be a young girl today in many ways because of misogyny. So, but that tells you just how bad it was back then, which is much worse. It was much worse. Which so there were huge changes that actually happened, and they happened because, and this is one of the things I want, you know, these articles about lessons, because people all of a sudden kind of encouraged each other to stop, you know, to challenge things in a way that like it is really remarkable. I mean, that kind of collective revolt against social standards and expectations, and how large it was and how well it succeeded, to where now I feel like you know, I can have my hair any length I like. I could be any gender I like. And in my circle, at least, I mean, there's still huge problems. But, you know, in many ways, the pre-1960s life was an apartheid state in where I am now in Louisiana. It was, you know, essentially a fascist state.
I was astonished when I went back to my hometown of Utica, New York, after many years, Rust Belt town, upstate New York, and went to my old neighborhood. And there were Black people living there. And I realized only in retrospect, it was completely segregated. That was a northern city. There was, you there?
Yeah.
Yeah. And there was a brain teaser, you know, these little puzzles that magazines would publish, that came out when I was around 10 or 11, and nobody could answer it. And I'll tell you what it was. This was the brain teaser. A father and son are in a car accident. The father is killed and the son is badly injured. He's taken to the emergency room where he urgently needs an operation. The doctor who can do the operation rushes in and says, "I can't operate on him. He's my son. How is this possible?" And people would go, "Wait a minute, you said the father was dead, right?" "Yes, the father is dead." "Beats me." And the answer is, "The doctor is a woman." And everybody would go, "Oh yeah, I guess that's possible." That's how different things were.
Right.
You know, so yeah, some things, they're not where they should be, but they're definitely different than they were.
I mean, the proportions of you know, the gender ratio in the professions. I mean, there's still places like engineering and such where there's still bad statistics, but in other places like medicine, you know, we're getting closer and closer to 50-50. And in some fields, I think like psychology, have actually passed 50-50. And it used to be like 5% or less, you know, and starting at zero. So, and the important thing to me is like, looking back at all of these people who are really tremendously inspiring, and looking at their mistakes, looking at their triumphs, reading their writings again. I've read a great book of interviews that actually had interviews with Country Joe McDonald and with Paul Krasner, who ran the underground newspaper, The Realist, and they're just fascinating people who have a lot to say about. And I interviewed Lee Weiner of the Chicago 7 late last year, and he was fascinating. And they had so much to say that was really, really valuable. And I want to spark people's interest in this period of time in American history that was truly a unique moment for the left. And also there's that mixture of political revolution and cultural change, which I think that really had no, there are other times when the left has done reasonably well politically, like in the early 1900s, but this cultural change where like music and clothes and art transform, so quickly, so that this year is not like last year and last year is not like the previous year. Just this astonishing outburst of human creativity that makes you think, it should make you believe in the potential for the world to change very fast and in very unexpected ways.
Well, that's a great point, Nathan. And of course, it can. I mean, that's right. I mean, if it did in the past, it can again in the present. So, I mean, I think this notion that, it flies in the face of the sort of orthodoxy, the primarily Democratic Party orthodoxy now, since Republicans are able to force, I would say, more significant changes in recent decades. But this notion that you only have a narrow band that you can operate in. Mm-hmm. But I also have to add that I think we've become more sophisticated as the power elites in this country have become more sophisticated at thwarting radical change than they were in the 60s. I mean, I think of the coordinated response to the Occupy movement. If you remember how when the Occupy movement started, it changed the political discourse overnight. Yeah. And everybody, even Republicans, were talking about the 99% versus the 1%. And Mitt Romney was running for president, and he talked about the 99%. And Obama's platform shifted, I think, significantly in response to Occupy. Yeah. But within weeks, and 2/3 of the public supported it. Within weeks, it had been suppressed, broken up. Obama said it's a municipal problem, which really infuriated me because, I mean, he was basically saying like waste disposal, breaking up these demonstrations is a municipal problem, which when it was a national movement. And I think there's just a lot more sophistication in terms of how to respond to potential change. And I think any one of us that wants to foster real change, in some ways it can't be forced, I guess, but when those moments appear, we have to get a lot smarter about expecting the reaction that's likely to come.
Yeah.
What do you think? I mean, that's my take, but.
Yeah, no, that's probably true. And it's also the case that ultimately the 60s political movement did not succeed, right? I mean, Richard Nixon got elected in 1968, and there was tremendous backlash. And so we could say, well, there's, if there's more sophistication today, it was actually quite sophisticated then too. The Black Panthers were infiltrated and destroyed. Similar things happened to the American Indian movement. So you had these phenomenal acts of self-organization and heightened consciousness, and of course the drug, the crackdown on LSD was very successful, so and the Vietnam War dragged on for another 7 years after Nixon's election. So that there is a depressing story you can tell, which is about everyone kind of waking up and getting in a position of revolt and loving each other, and then it all kind of fizzling. But at the same time, so I think there are many stories you can tell about the 60s. But what I do think is that, like, it's so important to understand ourselves as people living in history, and one of the very clarifying things we can do to help understand that we ourselves are just people living through times that will pass and will go one way or the other depending on what we do and what happens, is to look at previous movements, previous times, and to see what choices, and it helps you understand, the range of choices you might have. It helps you. I mean, I wrote an article about Martin Luther King in 2018, and it was called "Seeing Martin Luther King as a Human Being," and it was about all of his sort of internal struggles as just a guy, right? Where he's just a person trying to figure out what to do next, and it's quite difficult, and suffering these crises of confidence and this lack of knowledge whether what you're doing is having any effect. And so I think, everyone can take really, really, it's clarifying and it's insightful and it's inspiring to look at all of these people who did very, very valuable work at this time under conditions that were in many ways in some ways easier, but in many ways much more difficult than conditions we face today, where we have a lot more of certain kinds of freedom.
Well, it's interesting you mentioned King, because I remember when he was assassinated, that there was this outpouring of grief for him, and I remember from all quarters. And I remember thinking, you people despised him 3 days ago, and that's reflected in poll numbers too. That he was disliked by at least 2/3 of, as I recall, of the American people, because he had the courage to stand up against the war in Vietnam and economic injustice and class issues, and so they couldn't stand him until he was assassinated. And I think over time he's becoming vindicated. Same thing with the feminists, who I think were amazing thinkers and writers. If you haven't, you should go back and watch the town hall with Norman Mailer and Germaine Greer. And the other people on stage aren't as engaging to me. Germaine Greer is amazing. And the amount of the courage and insight that a Germaine Greer, a Gloria Steinem, that those people had to really think dramatically differently, Shulamit Firestone, about things people always took for granted. To me, that's one of the great lessons of the 60s, and whether it's surrealists in France or, we could pick different historical examples, but the ability to step out of the assumed borders of reality and imagine something different, and then be fearless in the pursuit of it, to me is a great historical example.
Yeah, and sometimes it's easy to miss this stuff because Germaine Greer, as I was growing up, was on a reality television show. I think she was on like Celebrity Big Brother or something, and was known for, she was in the press for making all these awful comments about transgender people. And
I remember that happened later. Yeah.
If that's all you see, then and of course those things are indefensible. But if that's all you see and you miss, and you see like, a lot of people end up in a lot of 60s radicals. Some of them turned conservative later on. Some of them just sort of never recaptured never maintained that form of. Some people like Bernie Sanders are like still the same as they were in 1964, but a lot of people are not. And so going back and finding the things that they did that are kind of lost, because obviously, as you say, the radicalism of someone like King gets sanitized and gets lost. So you have to go back into the archives and you have to find a lot of this stuff. You got to reread things like the Port Huron Statement and all these manifestos. And you got to do some digging in order to find what people really, find the archive clips of these kinds of the debates. That's where you find what inspires you, and don't read the kind of potted summary that Forrest Gump view of I call it the Forrest Gump view of the 60s, because it's just like a collage, a panorama of like, there was something happening here, lots of things, soldiers in the streets, hippies, beads, that's it.
Yeah, no, you're right. And by the way, I'd forgotten about what happened to Germaine Greer, but I do remember that when I was working for Bernie in 2016, Gloria Steinem got in a lot of trouble for a dismissive remark. I think she was trying to be funny, where she said, the young women just support Bernie because that's where the boys are. And she got in a lot of trouble for that. But I never forgot what a revolutionary thinker she was at her time.
Right.
And I told a mutual acquaintance, I know how to get her out of trouble right away, within 24 hours. She can endorse Bernie. And our mutual friend went, that's not going to happen. It was like, okay, well, don't say I didn't suggest a solution that would be happy. But, I honor and respect these people. I have enormous regard for Abbey. If you haven't gone back and listened to some of his speeches, Steve Earle has a song where he uses clips from an Abbey speech. I've been trying to find the whole speech. I can't find it, but, he was, he had mental health problems and so on later, but he was was probably a difficult person. I interviewed my brother, who worked with him closely on this show, about him, but I have enormous regard for him, and still do.
I wrote an essay about him too recently, because the Sorkin movie about the Chicago 7 came out, and Abbie Hoffman's this colorful character in it, but it really doesn't convey that much of his moral seriousness that underlay it all. But if you read especially his autobiography, because he's known for Steal This Book, which is a bit pretty dated, but his autobiography is wonderful. I'm fascinated by him and love him as a figure.
My brother helped him with that autobiography.
Oh, really? Okay.
And I think
he
had a little bit of trouble about it. I think they went to a people's court or something to work it out. I can't remember now. But I think that I'm trying to think of a way to tie this all together. I didn't watch the Aaron Sorkin movie. I know a lot of those early activists turned into something very different, but as you say, a lot of them didn't. Same thing with a lot of the musicians. A lot of the musicians, didn't care as much about material success as some of the others and kept doing what they were doing. I think particularly the experimental jazz musicians, but a lot of other folks as well. There are a lot of talented people there in a lot of different fields still out there, including activism and music, but they're just not getting the public traction they got in the 60s.
Right.
Maybe you can help with that. You've got a magazine.
Well, I mean, I am encouraged that we have a vibrant left at the moment, and that's why I wanted to write this, is to say, well, look, things can grow. We can continue. We can innovate culturally. We should be excited to find out what is next. If we show the same level of commitment to raising consciousness and exploring the possibilities for the transformation of human society, it might not work, but there's really there is a lot that they did accomplish, and that should make us feel pretty good, even in hopeless times, because no times seemed more hopeless than the time when that horrific war was just grinding, destroying millions of Vietnamese people and drafting and killing many young Americans, and of course, as I say, you had in the South essentially an apartheid state. If people could fight that and go against it, and in some ways win, then what can we accomplish ourselves?
Yeah, I had the surrealistic experience of watching them draw birthdays out of a big rolling cage to see if I would be drafted and sent to Vietnam or not. But Jesus. My birthday was 310 out of 365, so I didn't have to go. By the way, David Graeber, the anthropologist who was on the show a couple times, who's unfortunately passed away, wrote that Abbie Hoffman won because American military policy since the Vietnam War, we've never committed large numbers of troops again. because the military learned from Abbey and the movement that if you draft young Americans, the American people will eventually turn against you. You'll trigger a movement. So that's why we've always fought proxy wars since then. But unfortunately, I think we're going to have to leave it here. But I love the fact that you explored this issue. I'm sorry we didn't get to talk about your other piece about billionaires, the opposite end of the spectrum, but I applaud you because you actually read a number of their autobiographies.
I did. I read a whole stack of billionaire memoirs.
Well, better you than me. And the self-regard is astonishing, though. But I guess you have to have that self-regard to justify your disproportionate wealth. I don't know. In any case, Nathan J. Robinson, author, essayist, editor and publisher of Current Affairs. It's always a pleasure to talk to you, my friend. So thanks for exploring this issue.
A delight. And thanks, RJ.
And we'll be right back after this with all our peace and love. I'm Richard RJ Eskow, and you are listening to The Zero Hour.